Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of the South-South Dialogue series that was developed by the Justicia and our colleagues from the Legal Agenda in Beirut, Lebanon. This series is possible thanks to the support of the FAR Foundation and is part of a broader project that seeks to facilitate a much-needed global discussion on shared human rights challenges and the exchange of experiences between regions of the world. My name is Ligia Ramirez Bolívar, and I'm the coordinator of migration in the international area at the Justicia in Bogotá, Colombia. Buenos días para las personas hispanohablantes. Podrán ver la transmisión en español a través del Facebook Live del periódico El Espectador en el link que encuentran en nuestra sección de comentarios. Pueden dejar también sus preguntas en español y nosotros las traduciremos para los panelistas. In this session, forced migration, closure of borders, xenophobia, and discriminatory treatment in the context of a global pandemic, we seek to explore the different challenges that migrants and refugees face in the global South countries and to understand what the current impact of the COVID-19 crisis is on the protection of their rights. Before introducing our panelists, I would like to welcome Melissa Avila from Melissa Drow's Wiser Together, who is joining us today and will be creating a graphic summary of our conversation, which will compile the most important points discussed and will be available for download at the end of this session. Melissa, can you please show us your empty board so the audience can see how the process starts? Thank you. We are not hearing you, Melissa.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, Lucia. I'm gonna share you my screen right now so you can see my canvas. Here it is. So I'll be graphic recording all the session, and at the end, I'm gonna show you the outcome.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So now I would like to introduce our four panelists, all of them women, experts in the field of migration and refugee studies, and he will share their reflections as advocates of migrants and refugee rights from different parts of the world. The first person I would like to introduce is Gabriella Sánchez. Gabriella is a research fellow of border enforcement and immigration control at the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. As an anthropologist, she has written extensively about the criminalization of migrants' clandestine journeys and has particularly focused on documenting the experiences of migration facilitators. While she's currently examining migrant smuggling dynamics in the Mediterranean, she will speak today about her ongoing research on the US-Mexico border, where as a migrant herself, she has lived for most of her life and her academic career. Also joining us is Ligia Bolívar. Ligia is a human rights researcher and Venezuelan activist. She was the director of the Center for Human Rights at the Andrés Bello Catholic University from 1999 to 2018. She's the founder of the Venezuelan Program for Education Action on Human Rights, PROVEA, and co-founder of the Center for Justice and International Law, CEGIR, in Washington, D.C. Currently, Ligia is a fellow from the Global South at the Justicia. From Lebanon, we have Ghida Frangieh. Ghida is a lawyer and researcher. She worked as a legal advisor for the protection of refugees and stateless persons with Frontiers Ruwad Association and is currently a practicing lawyer at the Nizar Sayed law firm in Beirut. She is also a board member of the Ruwad Al-Hukuk NGO and president of Legal Agenda's board. Her current research interests focus on criminal justice, migration, and nationality. Thank you for being here, Ghida. Samar Muhareb joined us from the Middle East as well. Samar is the co-founder and CEO of the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, a Jordanian NGO that works to respond to the Iraqi refugee crisis. Having worked as a lawyer and a worker in international organizations for many years, she realized that one of the most urgent needs refugees and marginalized individuals and community face is access to justice, regardless of the immigration status. Welcome, Samar. Thanks to all of you for your willingness to share your time and expertise with us, and for what I'm sure will be a very fruitful and interesting conversation. To start, I would like to provide an overview of migrants and refugee situation around the world. According to the most recent global report from UNHCR, 70.8 million people have been forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. Almost 42% of them have left their home countries. During 2018, 30,007 people had to flee their homes every day. 60% of all refugees come from countries in the global south: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. But also the four main countries of asylum for refugees were also global south countries: Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda, and Sudan. All of them countries from the global south. In the Americas, the political and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela have forced more than 5 million people to leave the country. In the Middle East, Lebanon continued to host the largest number of refugees relative to its national population. 1 in 6 people is a refugee in that country. Before the pandemic, migrant and refugees populations worldwide already faced critical situations regarding access to legal status, recognition of the refugees' status, access to food, health services, and to employment with dignity, among other challenges. Many migrants derive their income from informal work and face situations of labor exploitation. They also face discrimination and stigmatization not only from the recipient communities, but from local and national government authorities. The pandemic has aggravated this situation by pushing many migrants to be evicted from their homes, lack of sufficient food, and consequently become more exposed to the virus. Given the uncertainty generated by the closure of borders and the economic impact of preventive measures, many have had no alternative but return to their place of origins. In this context, the response from the recipient states has not been according to the needs of population. We have seen critical cases. For example, in Hungary, the Prime Minister Viktor Orban declared that there was a link between coronavirus and illegal migrants and adopted measures to disproportionately affect this population, such as closing the border transit camps. On the other side of the Atlantic, Donald Trump has taken advantage of the crisis to expose his xenophobia and reinforce his anti-immigration sentiments. The situation of adults and children detained in immigration centers is very worrisome, considering that the government has refused to release them. In this context, the pandemic is reshaping mobility dynamics and is producing new immigration patterns. In particular, the unprecedented context of border restrictions and pandemic mitigation measures have provoked two distant but interrelated contradictory processes: returns and forms in mobility. However, there are some good news. Some states have taken positive steps to include this population in the response to the emergency. For example, in Portugal, the government granted temporary residency to all persons who have pending immigration and refugee application. This will enable them to access to health services and some social programs. Also, in Chile, Argentina, France, and Germany, a temporary recruitment of foreign health professionals was allowed, and this measure will strengthen not only the health system, but also allow these people to have income to support themselves. The idea today is that our panelists help us to understand better the situation of migrants and refugees in the Americas and the Middle East, and to propose strategies to guarantee the protection of their rights. We invite you to leave any questions you may have for our panelists in the chat in English or Spanish or Arabic, and afterwards we will have a Q&A session. To start the discussion, I would like to invite Ghida and Ligia first to share with us a brief context of the immigration patterns in the region. Why are people being forced out of their countries? What are they facing in their journeys? And what has been the state response to this crisis? Sorry, I was disconnected for one moment. So Ligia, is your turn, please?
Thank you, Lucia, and good morning from Colombia. Good afternoon to Lebanon and Italy and elsewhere. I'm very glad to be able to participate in this conference and this meeting cycle with our colleagues from Legal Agenda, and I hope that a face-to-face activity can be carried out in the future as originally planned. To begin with, I must say that I have been working for the last 3 years on the second largest human rights mobility crisis in the world, today after Syria, which is Venezuela, with more than 5 million people, as Lucia already said. Um, that is 15% of the population. And for this reason, an important part of my presentation will be focused on this crisis. However, for 15 years, until 2015, when the Venezuelan Exodus began, the Human Rights Center of Andrés Bello University, where I work, was dedicated itself to attend the situation of migrants and refugees from other countries in the region arriving in Venezuela as recipient country. So I'm more or less familiar with the situation of mobility, human mobility in Colombia and Central America as well. In the case of Venezuela, forced migration takes place in a context of a complex humanitarian emergency where it is impossible for most people to have a bare minimum to live since there is a severe crisis of public services. The crisis is reflected in lack of water, electricity, public transportation, gasoline, internet, cooking gas, which adds to the previous crisis on health and food. A large part of the population has lost an average of 11 kilos, that's more than 20 pounds, in 1 year. Um, Children dismay in schools as well as teachers because of hunger. Since June 1st, filling a car gas tank costs $20, and that is equivalent to 4.3 minimum wages. On the other hand, the state has ceded control of part of the territory to organized crime groups and guerrilla associated with the military, and that is generating a situation of extreme violence as well. When people are asked about the reasons for leaving the country, the most common responses are violence and organized crime, hyperinflation and economic situation, lack of food, medication and medical supplies, and the collapse of public services. So for these reasons, in March 2018, UNHCR recommended states to apply the broad definition of um, um, refugees under the Cartagena Declaration to Venezuelans. The Cartagena Declaration was approved by Latin American countries in 1984, in the context of the civil wars in Central America. And this declaration establishes an expanded definition of refugee that goes beyond the classical definition and includes people who have fled their countries, and I quote here, because their lives, security, or freedom have been threatened by widespread violence, foreign aggression, internal conflict, massive human rights violations, or other circumstances that seriously disturb public order. That's the end of the quote. So it is not an international convention, it's soft law, but 15 countries in the region have passed legislation internally, making the declaration part of their national laws. However, it is not being applied to Venezuelans. In the case of Colombia, new forms of violence are taking place as a result of new disputes over control of territories between the guerrilla groups which did not participate in the peace agreements and dissident guerrilla groups of those which accepted the agreement, but decided to retake the struggle. In addition to that, paramilitary groups and organized crimes are also involved in these disputes, and the result is another wave of internal displacements and some asylum seekers. In Colombia, the situation also includes refugees from the period previous to the peace agreements, new refugees, displaced people, returnees, and binationals. So it's a combination of different kind of human mobility factors. In addition, there are nearly 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia, and half of them are in an irregular condition and 90% are working in the informal sector. In the case of Central America, human mobility occurs in a context of structural violence, with a strong presence of organized crime also that results in forced recruitment of young people, human trafficking, internal displacements, and obviously forced migration. This situation was the origin of the migrant caravans in October 2018, and President Trump's response was has been the increase of deportations and barriers, pressures to Mexico to stop the caravans, and the end of the special measures such as the deferred action of childhood arrivals. So Venezuelans, as well as Colombians and Central Americans, are facing similar problems before the pandemic. More restrictions to the most vulnerable, the effect of the increase of barriers, such as human trafficking, sex for survival, worse working conditions, and no access to rights. On the second aspect, in the case of Venezuela, the pandemic is an emergency within the emergency that generates new problems and increased pre-existing needs. According to the WHR, there are more than 1 million registered cases of COVID-19 and more than 50,000 deaths until June the 2nd in the region. So the pandemic has unveiled pre-existing needs related to the attention of migrants and refugees in all countries in the region. The Human Rights Center I work with carried out a survey on the response of the needs to the needs of migrants and refugees in the context of COVID-19, with a questionnaire that was sent to NGOs working for the rights of refugees and migrants in the region. And we received 45 replies from 16 countries. In general, the response from governments have been insufficient and inadequate in areas such as food, shelter, health, monetary transfer, and protection of the migrant status. The survey reflected a few mechanisms undertaken directly by the states. In the best scenario, countries have approved some measures and guidelines, but most of the responsibility to carry out social programs rests on the shoulders of civil society organizations with the support of international cooperation. In addition, there is a lack of information about the available plans or programs and how to have access to them. A good practice that we can see in many countries is in the area of health. Most countries has taken measures to ensure that there is free attention to foreigners, independent, regardless their migration condition. However, the labeling of these migrants and refugees that has been made as bearers of the virus generates more xenophobia and inhibits them sometimes from going to the diagnostic centers. In fact, this is not only happening outside the countries. In the case of Venezuela, it's also happening inside the country. People who are returning to the country from outside have been labeled as biological weapons by President Maduro, saying that they were sent back with the virus on purpose by President Duque from Colombia. There are, as I was saying anyway, there are some positive measures. One is the free and universal access to health and diagnosis during the pandemic. And another positive measure adopted by a large number of countries is the deferral or the postponement of the expiration dates of visas, work permits, and other migration documents. Again, the problem is that lack of information about these measures. An issue of concern is also that the contingency measures, such as mobility restrictions, are increasing the risk for migrants, refugees, and displaced persons. When the border crossing points are closed and people are determined to continue the route, they might choose to continue by illegal crossings, most of which are controlled by criminal groups. It is important, as Lucia already stressed, that the Global South is receiving most of the burden with regard to refugees. Nearly 70% of the refugees remain in countries in the Global South. In late May, the European Union and the government of Spain organized a donors conference in solidarity with migrants and refugees from Venezuela. Civil society organizations present a number of demands to the states, which I think are valid for the situation of migrants and refugees from other countries in the region as well. Among these demands are first a significant increase of funding to respond to the COVID-19 crisis in a sustainable and timely way. Secondly, it was also requested to donors and the UN agencies to ensure speed and transparency in resource allocation to organizations in the front line, especially local organizations in the field, because they are the ones responding to the needs of most vulnerable sectors. Another aspect that was raised before the conference was also the request to ensure active, substantial, and binding participation of civil society organizations in the governmental coordination spaces and decision-making process. And this is probably one of the most crucial things because, as I already said, local NGOs are in the front line, are not being taken into account when decision-making, during the decision-making process. So I finish here, looking forward to the debate and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ligia. Some takeaways from your intervention. I would like to highlight the Venezuelans are not being recognized as refugees, even though the definition of the Cartagena Declaration fits for them. And their situation is getting worse with the pandemic. However, there have been some positive measures. I just want to put into the debate the questions about, even though we have universal health access for emergency care, the difficulties in the field are very prominent. We have problems for migrants to actually access to health services. So that's one of our concerns, that even though legally they are allowed to do only for emergency care, there are many other situations where they cannot actually receive the service. So now I would like to open the floor for Ghida. Ghida, can you please tell us a little bit about the Middle East?
Yes, hello. So I'm very happy to be here, actually, especially on this all-women panel today. And I really think that these conversations are very important at this critical time, not only inside our organizations and country, but also across the different continents as we're doing today. As you were mentioning before, MENA is a region that has always been shaped by migration movements, whether forced displacement or also mixed migration movements. Arab countries are both countries of origin, countries of transit, and destination as well when it comes to migration. And if we look at Lebanon more closely, Lebanon currently is hosting refugees that are forced to be displaced from persecution or conflicts in Arab countries such as Palestine since over 70 years now, and Syria at least since 2011, Iraq since the 90s, Sudan as well, but also we have refugees from Ethiopia. We also have migrant workers from other countries, especially from the African and Asian continents, mainly from Ethiopia, Bangladesh, India, Philippines, and other countries as well. So But you were saying, since the influx of refugees from Syria, this is when Lebanon started to, or became to be considered as the country that is hosting the highest number of refugees compared to its population. Ironically, we do not have an official number, neither of refugees nor of the Lebanese population, because we haven't had a census since 1932. And I think that just gives you an idea what kind of bad governance Lebanon has and the situation we're facing today. Statistics are always problematic, but we do estimate that we have around 1 to 2 million registered and undocumented refugees and migrants for a population of around 4 to 5 million. The majority of them are, of course, refugees from Syria. There are two important aspects that I would just like to highlight before we talk about the impact of the COVID crisis. Aspects related to migration policies and management in Lebanon, but it also applies to most of the Arab countries. The first one is that we have a very weak framework that relating to asylum. Most Arab countries haven't signed the 1951 convention. And specifically, Lebanon doesn't have a good legal framework for asylum. And its constitution was actually amended in 1990 after the war to include a specific provision that prohibits the settlement of foreigners in Lebanon. And that applies to refugees and migrants to whom we never give access to permanent residency or to nationality. So for the last 3 decades, actually, the official policy of Lebanon has been that we are not a country of asylum. But if you want to nuance that, because I mean, you can't just not be a country of asylum and be hosting that many refugees, Lebanon considers itself not to be a permanent country of asylum, but rather a temporary one. That means refugees are not officially recognized by Lebanese authorities. So they are denied residencies. Syrians, for example, only 22% of registered Syrians actually have resident status. All the rest are irregular and therefore are at risk of arrest and deportation at any moment. They are denied the right to work and make a living. And of course, that affects all their other rights, such as access to housing, healthcare, and others. And the government considers that it's up to NGOs and international organizations, including UN agencies, to provide services for migrant and refugees. So the government of Lebanon does not see itself as an authority that is responsible to service these communities. A second very important aspect that also applies to most Arab countries is that most migrants fall under the kafala regime or the sponsorship regime, which I'm sure many of you might have heard of. Now, the details of the kafala regime change between each country, but basically they all tie the migrant's legal status to the will of an employer who is a sponsor, and it grants a lot of privileges to that employer, makes it nearly impossible for a migrant to actually change work or to remain in the country or to leave it unless that sponsor approves. And in Lebanon, we have a lot of live-in migrant domestic workers in several households, including low to medium income households as well. And these are also subjected to the kafala regime, but they are also excluded from the protection of the labor law. And this is important, of course, because the historic gender discrimination considers that domestic work is not work and its economic value is therefore not recognized. Now, these two aspects that I wanted to highlight was because it's just to show that the legal framework, and specifically in Lebanon, is one that actually facilitates the exploitation and the human trafficking of migrants, be it sexual exploitation or forced labor. We have a consistent pattern of abuse of rights. We have impunity and lack of accountability for employers and recruiters, complete lack of accountability. And that's why we consider that this legal framework actually manufactures the vulnerability of migrants in order to enable their exploitation. And a large part of our economy is actually based on the exploitation of the labor of foreigners from low-income communities in other countries. And many of our key economic sectors are predominantly operated by migrants, such as the garbage and cleaning sectors, construction, and also agriculture. And it is because of this framework that we have a lot of informal work as well. A lot of migrants find themselves in situations of informal work. So just 3 questions that we were asking ourselves in at Legal Agenda, and I would like to make a few observations around. One is, how did all these lockdown restrictions impact on migrants, specifically on their freedom of movement? And also to what extent they were granted access to healthcare service, and particularly to COVID-19 related services. And the third, and I think most important, has to do with the economic impact and risk of exploitation that has come out after all this crisis. there's something that I should start by saying, and I think it's very important to remind everyone who's not familiar with the Lebanon context, and that is that Lebanon is, contrary to other countries, is suffering from the most dangerous economic and financial crisis of its history, even before the COVID-19 crisis. It's a crisis that is similar to what we're seeing in Venezuela or what we've seen in Argentina: huge budget deficit, public debt, pound devaluation, and people's savings are now frozen at the banks, which of course led to a very big movement of popular and social uprising as of October. So basically, people were losing their jobs and their wages even before the COVID-19 crisis. And the migrants have felt the heavy toll of this. With the Lebanese pound devaluation, they've had a huge decrease in the value of their wages. With the rising inflation, the cost of life, the cost of food has become extremely expensive. We've seen a lot of evictions from their homes. And most importantly, a lot of migrants have been unable to send remittance back home, which is the primary reason why they've left their homes initially. So life had already become extremely difficult for migrants before the COVID crisis. And now, with all its economic implication, life has simply become unbearable. And I think one of the very symbolic moments of that was the Syrian refugee, Bassam Halla, who actually ended his life by burning himself just last month. It was quite a heartbreaking scene. It was very symbolic to the pain and despair that most residents in Lebanon are feeling now because they're no longer able to provide for their basic needs and live in dignity. So if we look more closely at the impact of the COVID crisis, and starting with freedom of movement and the limitations that came from border closures, two things came out of those border closures. One was that forced returns were stopped, and the other was that voluntary returns were also stopped. So, of course, the fact that there was an unofficial moratorium, if you want, on deportations, that was good for most of the refugees. Because we have a problem in Lebanon that deportations are very swift and they don't respect due process, and it's very difficult to stop them. And deportation is a very important tool in migration management. I'll try to come back to that later. So we do expect those to return. However, a lot of refugees and migrants were actually released from prisons during this period as part of the government effort to reduce prison overcrowding. So these are some of the positive measures we can mention. On the other hand, the fact that migrants were no longer able to return home if they wanted, and it's important to note that the number of those who want to leave Lebanon have dramatically increased in the last months. So we've had Syrians who were stuck in the no man's land in the border between Lebanon and Syria. We've had Sudanese trying to cross the Israeli border into the occupied Palestinian territory, and that's a very sensitive matter because this is a conflict border. We've had migrants camping outside embassy, trying to find a way out of the country and not being able to cover the costs of their repatriation. And that's a very important element that we do need to address. 5 minutes. Okay. Well, I also wanted to mention that when it comes to freedom of movement inside the countries, we saw that migrants were suffering from more severe restrictions on their freedom of movement compared to other Lebanese. We saw refugee settlements that were completely shut off from the country. We also saw different curfews being imposed on refugee settlements as opposed to the curfews that were imposed to the Lebanese. And that's, of course, because of the government failure to assume that responsibility and local authorities abusing that lockdown. And of course, these limitations did impact their access to healthcare. It's important to note here that migrants' access to healthcare has always been precarious in Lebanon. But when it came to the COVID health service, the first approach of the government was to say that it was up to the international organizations to service migrants. But we did see that they were actually, those services were integrated into the government's response. I won't go into the details of all this, but one important thing to mention is that we've had so far 3 clusters in migrant communities, one in Palestinian refugee camp, one in a Syrian community, and one in a building inhabited by Bangladeshi workers. And the most important thing we've noticed is that there was a fear of reporting COVID-19 symptoms. Although the government had a moratorium on arrest, so no one was arrested just for reporting symptoms or entering hospital, but social stigma was a big barrier. And we had several cases where we had Syrian families who were evicted from their homes, from the settlements where they had been living for 7 years, simply because one of their members went to buy a pain reliever from a pharmacy, and the local community considered that to be an infection. Last notes that I wanted to make, if I could have just a couple of few minutes, have to do with the protection from exploitation. Or if we consider that access to health services might have been a good practice so far in Lebanon, but we are still investigating that before we can draw this conclusion. This was not the case when it came to exploitation. I mentioned that the legal framework on migration facilitates forms of forced labor, and the economic collapse has really revealed the ugly face of the kafala system. Just want to mention two examples on this. First is the domestic workers. Now, I mentioned that a lot of workers had been camping outside of embassy, many of them either unable to pay their rent, or they became homeless after their employers actually threw them out without paying their wages. For the first time ever, last night at midnight, we saw the Ministry of Labor intervene to provide emergency shelter for domestic workers, something that the government has not done before for migrants. So that's a positive measure. However, we have hundreds of domestic workers who are still held hostages in homes, working for free without being paid, and without any foreseeable possibility to be paid or to actually leave Lebanon. And let's remember that employers have been confined home, which has increased the risk of violence and domestic violence on these workers. And instead of the government coming in to help these workers to get out of those exploitative situations, the immigration authorities did the exact opposite, and they allowed the sponsors to renew residencies without requesting the worker to actually give their approval for their renewal or to show up to the immigration authority and express their approval for that renewal. And this is the only opportunity that a living domestic worker actually has to get out of an exploitative employer. A second example that I wanted to give has to do with the migrant workers at the biggest garbage collection company in Lebanon. They've around 500 workers who work at the Aramco company, mostly from Bangladesh and India. They lost like a third of their wages, and they were reporting mistreatment, abuse, and very bad medical and working conditions, and they went on strike. This was the first time that we've seen a group of migrants actually go on strike in order to negotiate better working conditions. Of course, the company's response was very violent. They called in the anti-riot police, who beat the migrant up and used tear gas against them. And this is not just any company. This is one of the biggest government contractor that is accused of corruption. 3 weeks later, the strike was ended, and when we interviewed the migrants, what they said, and I think these are important remarks to conclude with, they said that the media attention, including Legal Agenda's attention, had helped them a lot to negotiate and to improve their working conditions. And one of them said, describing why they've ended the strike, they said, "We are poor and we have come here to work, not to fight." And I really find this statement very symbolic, which is why I wanted to conclude with, because it shows how safe and secure jobs are a priority for all. And it also shows how important it is to work for that, so that migrants can actually assemble, unionize, and engage in collective negotiations around their working conditions. But it also shows how important it is for the media to shed light on these violations and to break that isolation that the kafala system imposes on migrants so that they can be better exploited. And just really in conclusion, I'd say, I mean, as I was saying in the beginning, the migrant population is the backbone of our economy, and yet they are bearing the biggest cost of our economic collapse. And I think the only way forward from here, and we can discuss this later, is not only to reform our laws to limit those possibilities of exploitation, but also to ensure that migrants themselves have the ability to defend their own rights, both individually and collectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ghida. I see so many common trends between our two regions, and I would like to highlight two things that you mentioned. First is there are not accurate data about the number of refugees and migrants that are in our regions. We share the same problem here. Our borders are very open, so it's difficult to control how many people is here, but also there are not many efforts from the government from the different governments in the region to characterize this population. So we really don't know how many people needs to the support to overcome this pandemic. And second, the legal frameworks enable exploitation and human rights violation. I think that's a very powerful statement. For example, here in Colombia, even though the constitution established that migrants and refugees have the same civil and political rights than nationals, we see that in practice it's very difficult for them to access to these rights due to the legal barriers that they face to access to work or health services besides emergency care. So those things are very worrisome, and we share in our two regions. So coming back to the Americas, I would like to give Gabriella the floor. Thank you so much for being here, Gabriella.
No, thank you so much for the invitation. Buenos días para todos en Colombia y buenas tardes para todos de este lado del Atlántico. My name is Gabriella Sánchez, and I am a fellow at the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute. And I am very grateful to Lucia for putting this together, and of course to Legal Agenda for the invitation. So thank you so much. I think that it's important to start again by acknowledging how common the factors or the dynamics that we face are. I think there's already a trend that is emerging. In the case of the U.S.-Mexico border, I think it's also important to highlight not only the border, because I think that many times there's this hyper visibility of borders, right? That we just want to focus on specific hubs or areas. But on how I would rather talk about how the US-Mexico border is a reflection of a much larger dynamic that we're witnessing across Latin America. As Ligia was mentioning earlier, the dynamics of migration from Venezuela are only one of a multiple set of trends that we're witnessing across the continent. We have people from the Caribbean, we have people from South America, we have people from Central South America. We also have extracontinental migrants that are moving right now, or who were moving across Latin America in their efforts to reach different destinations. I think it's also important in the sense to have an understanding that not everybody's aspiration is to reach the United States, despite this larger narrative that that's where everybody wants to go to. And how migrants or migrant people make decisions and change their minds as they progress, and also in response to many of these restrictions that are being imposed as they move along. Another point that, going back to what you were saying earlier, Lucia, we are talking about mostly this South, this movement within the South. So we have several millions of people on the move within, the sort of part of the continent within Latin America, and dentro de America Latina, and that have been in part obscured by, again, this hyper emphasis on the US-Mexico dimension that has been pretty dominant in the literature, and that is important that we revise as we want to understand the migration dynamics in the continent. But here today, I want to specifically talk about the work that, along with my colleagues from DIA, Derechos Humanos Integrales en Acción, I have been carrying out in Ciudad Juárez, which is one of the largest cities along the US-Mexico border, on the Mexican side of the border. And Ciudad Juárez, or Juárez as we call it, back in 2018, became one of the main hubs for migration-related activity. And this was connected again with the arrival of thousands of people to several cities along the US-Mexico border, trying to apply for asylum on the American side of the border, on the US side of the border. It took, the collective efforts of civil society, local government, a lot of the support from organizations on the American side of the border to create a certain stability, to provide a kind of a stable setting for the people who had arrived, knowing that those who wanted to enter the United States were also facing restrictions and limitations imposed by the Trump administration, and also an overall anti-immigrant climate in the country. So it took about, about a year for everybody's efforts to come to prosper. So by the beginning of this year, what we were witnessing was a certain level of stability. Many people already had jobs. Many of the people who had arrived to the border and who were waiting for their court dates had jobs, had a place to stay at. Shelters that had been set up, and the network of shelters that had responded to the initial emergency were reporting that their numbers were very low, were going down. And then suddenly in January, there was an outbreak of chickenpox at the federal shelter, which meant the partial closing of the shelter as a public health as a result of public health concerns. And that outbreak was immediately followed by COVID-19. So, which, as we know, has reshaped mobility, or has in fact bring to mobility to a stop. This was also accompanied by the coupling of series of measures that were adopted by the U.S. government that were masked as public health measures. By this, I'm referring to the specific decision of the U.S. government to shut down the border and in an effort to stop any legal processes that were leading to the arrival or of people who were seeking asylum. Court dates were canceled or postponed. We don't know when they are going to be able to take place again. All sorts of appointments or arrangements that could have taken place at that time to facilitate the reception, asylum, or protection of people who had the right to apply for those to follow their processes were canceled. So other implications that there was this unleashed or this sort of series of consequences that followed. We also started to see the shutting down, the closure of a lot of employment sites along the U.S.-Mexico border, manufacturing plants, maquiladoras, which had employed large numbers of migrants. Factories, manufacturing plants provide not the best, but perhaps better and higher salaries than what people would have been able to get in other forms of labor. So maquiladora shut down, people are unable to work. Those who were able not to get legal authorization to stay in the country had entered the informal economy, and that had created perhaps an informal but rather continued form of income. The restrictions to being outside, to being able to move, meant that they had to go back to their homes. But then the fact that people were not generating an income were also triggered the loss of these places where they had been able to live. So what we also witnessed was how many people were losing their homes and were returning to the shelters. The shelters at this point, once again, were no longer in a capacity to receive the numbers of people that they initially welcomed. And they were also, in fact, they had stopped welcoming people as a result of the emergency. So we had people who were, people who would have otherwise qualified for international protection without a place to go to, out on the street, without a job. Here, I'm kind of going back to what Ligia was mentioned at the beginning of her presentation as well. This puts people at risk of engaging with criminal activity. I am very critical of the term organized crime because I think it criminalizes entire communities. But what we know and what we have seen is that there was also a tendency for criminal entities local authorities, ordinary people, and other migrants to operate on the basis of scams, abuse, robberies, kidnappings, in many instances. So there's, once again, this vast numbers of the population that are experiencing very specific forms, again, of violence, not just your little message. I also want to bring, back into the conversation the issue of gender really quick, because many of the people who were staying at the shelters or who have managed to stay at the shelters are women and children. Women and children who had already experienced throughout their journeys high levels of violence, exclusion, and discrimination. And the being forced out of their homes, being forced out of the shelters, or having to return or trying to return to a shelter that won't take them, enhances the levels of vulnerability they have. And this is, again, particularly in the case of women and children who many times don't have the financial or the social capital to access forms of protection. We see, once again, the need, the very high need for mental health services in this context. I am going to conclude with 3 basic recommendations that were actually articulated by a collective of NGOs along the US-Mexico border and on both sides of the US-Mexico border, working with migrants. And one is precisely this provision of more inclusive information for migrants who are staying in shelters and in other facilities. And by more inclusive information, I think we also have to talk about indigenous populations. The fact that many of the people who are arriving to the US-Mexico border speak other languages and also deserve access to information concerning safety and protection. There's also the need to ensure widespread access to screenings and healthcare, especially in the case of Mexico. Mexico has one of the highest levels of COVID-19 cases. There's a lot of debate over what the numbers are actually revealing, what the official numbers actually say. And so that's why, once again, it's important that there's clear access to the services. And last but not least, there's widespread call for the suspension of mobility restrictions in cases of emergency, because we have also been able to document how there's disproportionate levels of migrants who are being criminalized through the restrictions, not to leave your home or your household. So being more aware of how these restrictions are further criminalizing migrant and refugee population in Mexico at this point. I will stop right there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Some highlights from your intervention. I really think it's very interesting that you said that in the literature, there is an emphasis in the situation of migrants and refugees in the US, and I will add in other developed countries. And we need to have more spaces like this to discuss what are the patterns of migration in the continent and in the global South in general. So I celebrate that we have this opportunity. And also, the closing of shelters has also happened here in Colombia, and since we are very close to Venezuela and many people walk through Colombia to go to other countries, they have been really affected by the closing of these shelters, especially women and children. And we also see it now with people returning again to Venezuela. So they don't have many support systems that can provide for them the basic needs that they need to meet at this moment. So thank you so much. So I will now leave the space for Samar, who is going to talk about her experience in the Middle East, but also in Jordan.
Yeah. Thank you so much for organizing this important discussion in a very special time. And I see it as a special time because it was a combination from what we heard with a combination of different feelings and different reflections from many fronts. This pandemic or this crisis represented a greater fear among the refugees and migrants themselves and among us as responders or activists within this sector. Fear of the unknown, of the uncertainty of this crisis, of the effect and the impact on the health situation of many crowded areas that hosting refugees and migrants in our countries. Fear of losing further economic opportunities for those refugees and migrants communities. They were struggling even before, as Ghida said, to keep and to protect. There was additional fear from new waves of discrimination and alienation for migrants due to the border closures, as we heard, and resentment to receive refugees in the fortunate countries or in the safe haven countries. So this combined fear at many levels represented as well a feeling of regret. How much we lost opportunities before to fix the situation. How much we regret now that we don't have enough systems in place to include everyone in our social protection services or social protection systems. In Jordan, just like elsewhere in the Arab world, we are struggling to have a database to enable us to deliver equal services to everyone. We are lacking legal frameworks that enables us to push to protect their rights equally with the host communities. So this level of regret and loss of opportunities pushed us to think of another combined feeling is the urgency that we need to respond to reform the situation. We need really to think how we can fix our governance systems worldwide, national-wise, and regionally as well. How can our governance systems and social, let's say, global responsibility would enable us to protect our communities, to protect the refugees and migrant workers, and to protect the dignity of the human beings wherever they are, regardless of their migration status or legal status. For these reasons, I felt from the beginning this is a crisis. It's a combination of a health COVID crisis and a migration crisis. I'm coming from a country that having 16 different refugees camps, 56 different nationalities of refugees and migrants in Jordan. Coming from this realization, and regionally, for instance, we have 58 different refugees camps for Palestinian refugees that they were residing for the last 70 years, as Ghida said. And now looking at the responses, we can see that the response was divided between different nationalities. For each nationality, unfortunately, or for each wave of those refugees or migrants, we have different systems or different services to be provided. This is all subject to international buy-in to certain political causes to start with for these refugees migration waves, or due to the aid systems that focusing on one refugee nationality or migration nationality rather than the other. So it's a very difficult, complicated scene when you have this threat of a pandemic, of a health crisis, and a migration crisis, just emerging in a new scenes and a new challenges for all of us. In Jordan, for instance, to be more focused or narrowing the picture for Jordan, we have around 700 cases of COVID-affected cases, unfortunately. Only 6 of those were for refugees. This tells us 2 things. First of all, luckily, the refugees, they were able to protect themselves. Their level of awareness, I think it was great. Their controlled, let's say, livelihood situation enabled them to be protecting from being affected or infected by the virus. Like their mobility level is a little bit restricted in Jordan. So thanks to them that they protected themselves. And I would say thanks to God that we did not have more cases among the refugees or migration crisis, because I cannot imagine what would be the response toward them. The second factor that we have 6 cases of refugees on migration. Of course, they will be marginalized from the response, and they will not be prioritized in our calls and demands in terms of including them in social protection services in Jordan. However, the positive thing, what happened in Jordan, that the government and aid system, aid agencies, they responded equally to everyone, and they tried to cover the needs that protect or control the COVID itself as a problem from being harmful to everyone. However, until now, this is the temporary procedure. This is the situation until now. Now, as everyone expected, what is the future? It is what is alarming us. What is the aftermath of this crisis, and what would happen to those refugees? It is what represent to us the greater challenge and the greater threat. For sure, women, youth, children, elderly people, refugees, and migration with disabilities, all of these different categories when the refugees and migration, within the refugees and migration communities are facing different kind of challenges and problems and needs. So how we can have a holistic approach to cover different needs and services for all of those, and prevent further deterioration in their situation, in order to stop their demand to migrate outside of our countries and to put a push into other borders to resort to them to secure a better livelihood situation. Recently, last week, unfortunately, hundreds of refugees, they sacrificed themselves to smugglers and illegal migration pathways to resort to Italy. Which one of the smugglers in these clashes was killed, and his family retaliated, or they took revenge from those refugees by killing, from these migrants, by killing 30 of them. Of course, as NGOs working in this sector and activists, we initiated a statement, and we called for our governments to respond better, to avoid further calls to migration to other countries, because we know there are no safe pathways or legal pathways nowadays for secured migration. But what are the alternatives as well? Like, they are losing their jobs day by day. There are several calls for nationalization. Migrants from our own host communities, like Jordanians or Lebanese, they were returned from different countries back to their country of origins. This call of nationalization to protect the few opportunities within the labor sector, they are trying to protect it for their own nationals or countries. Even our laws and defense orders, they were calling for giving the priority for keeping the jobs for Jordanians only. There were official calls to fire or to put on hold all the recruitment for refugees and migrants, and this tells us the fragility of all of these international commitments to the Global Compact or the London Conference. We made a huge pledges that we want to recruit refugees and to issue work permits for all refugees, or particularly Syrian refugees. And at the first shock, the first ones to be compromised, and they are refugees on migration, and no one is saying anything. I would end by saying this complicated scene silenced us, silenced all of us in the time where should we having higher voices or louder voices to come together to solve all of these things. How much resources do we have? For sure, not that much. International aid systems are struggling. Most of our NGOs they are depending on American funding, for instance, and we can see globally the greater threats and greater challenges on the global economy for aid and all of these things. We call for sure for more solidarity movements among ourselves, international actors, regional actors. In the Arab world, we initiated something called Marfa. It's a new platform where we are having experts from all around the Arab world, from Lebanon, Egypt, Sudan, Libya to come together, and we want to work with our governments to fix the situation. At least regionally, we have a solidarity movement or unified policies that would enable us to capitalize on the limited resources that we have. Internationally, yes, we call for localization. We call for more sustainable approaches. So we call for inclusion and durable solutions for those refugees or migration. But do we want to be the container for refugees or migration from the global south? We cannot. It's not up to us if we want or we don't want, but we cannot. Our countries are fragile. We called for a global ceasefire and for greater calls for global justice for everyone. So are these the demands that we should now focus on the big global challenges? It's another question. So my last call is, what are the scenarios from now on? We should think of a real scenario for all migration and refugees and put our acts together to change the situation in a more solid ground, not to be shocked by a virus or a pandemic or another economic shock. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samar, to highlight two important points that you made. The first one is that in many situations, migrants were the ones to have to protect themselves from the virus because they didn't have the support from the governments that has these international obligations. Second, the importance of fight for reshape our government system and have a holistic approach to attend migrants and refugees. And final, I would like to highlight the very worrisome statement that you made that now, due to the closing of borders, migrants and refugees are being more exposed than ever to smuggling and human trafficking. So thank you so much for your intervention. So now I would like to we already have two questions, and then I will have a couple more for you. So the first one is for Ligia. Ligia, someone in the audience asked, how can we explain the absence of refugee camps in Latin America, considering the huge mobility phenomenon since 2015 in a comparative perspective that acknowledge them being the main organized responsibility compared to Europe?
Thank you. I think that there are different aspects that can explain that situation. First, most of the persons living in Venezuela are not being recognized as refugees, so they are not refugee camps. They are not requesting refugee either because the system in general in most countries is dissuasive. So you are not encouraged by the system to request refugee status because in some countries, once you request the refugee status, you cannot work, for example, with a few exceptions, but that is the general trend. So people don't apply for refugee status. Thirdly, because and this is a guess. The first two reasons are objective points, but the third is a guess. I guess that because we live in the same region with the same language, with the same more or less the same culture, people try to integrate themselves to the local culture. Try to provide their own means to work. And in addition to that, it has to be said that the only case in which a refugee camp was organized, to say a word, in Colombia was a failure, a complete failure. There are some refugee camps in Guajira, in the north east of Colombia. There are also some refugee camps, if we can use that term, in northern Brazil. But it's a very provisional settlement. The idea is that people are there for a given time. In the case of Brazil, the government is providing what they call internalization, which is moving people to different cities. Around more than 100 cities in Brazil are receiving migrants and refugees from Venezuela. So I don't know if that is an explanation, but at least this is the kind of answer I have been able to give to myself also.
Thank you, Ligia. Now I have one for Ghida. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on a specific violation women and girls face in the context of migration in Lebanon?
I did mention a little bit the situation relating to domestic workers, who are mostly women and who face a lot of gender discrimination. But in addition to the issues that I've mentioned related to living in isolation, non-payment of wages, being thrown out, and being forced into situations of forced labor due to the sponsorship system and to the confinement situation. We also had a rise in gender-based violence, a rise in domestic violence, both for Lebanese women as much as for migrant and refugee women. And most women who were surveyed as part of needs assessment reported that they had been feeling much less safe in their own homes. So as I mentioned, for instance, in refugee camps in a lot of areas, the camps were completely isolated from the rest of the country, not by decision of the community, but by decision of the local authorities using volunteer civilians to enforce those lockdowns, as I was explaining. And these women, many of them found themselves in situations where they were stuck inside the tents and inside the camps with violent abusers. And the hotlines, the domestic violence hotlines, exploded, according to a lot of the NGOs that are managing these hotlines. And one of our biggest problem was, of course, that the judiciary was not functioning well at the beginning, even for emergency services, and we did not have sufficient shelters. Many of the shelters closed in the first phases, in the initial phases of the lockdown, so there was no way out for these women. And then after a few weeks, and after I think within the second month, many of the judges who are involved in the protection in cases of domestic violence, which apply to Lebanese and migrant and refugees as well, started doing online hearings for women who are filing for protection orders. And that was very helpful. But that, of course, required that the woman would actually be able to access a lawyer, to access aid, and all of these being very problematic issues. And of course, in addition to these things, I mean, I mentioned that the overall racist and discriminatory approach that migrants were feeling throughout this period. Should probably mention that the overall approach of the government towards the lockdown was one that allowed the security approach to prevail over health concerns. And you have to understand that this is happening in the middle of political turmoil, economic collapse, but also a social uprising. And that approach meant that the whole management of the COVID crisis was very much marked by policing, whether be it by the media, be it by the government, or be it by civilian volunteers when it came to refugees. And the examples that I've mentioned of refugees being evicted due to symptoms similar to COVID, not even confirmed cases, but also refugee residents being policed or quarantined by the police just because of symptoms as well. All these discriminatory practice, be it for women or for others, showed us that racism, gender discrimination are all harmful practices for the public health. And I think this is important for us in our framing of those issues. We've already talked that overcrowding is, of course, harmful for public health, and everyone is discussing the situation of overcrowding in the shelters and housing of minors and how this affects them. But I think it's important for us to frame racist and discriminatory practice, be there on legal status or gender or ethnic affiliation or political or religious affiliation, we need to frame these racist practices as being also harmful for public health in our general advocacy and discourse, I think.
Thank you so much. So I have 4 questions for the 4 of you. So if you can please choose which question you want to answer, I will read all of them, and then you will have 2 minutes to answer. So the first one is, what do you think should be the role of the Global Compact of Refugees and the human rights international organizations to respond to the challenges you exposed today? Second, what could be the role of the national human rights institution, and specifically the role of judges and courts? And third one, also what could be the role of the media, and what strategies you can share to fight the xenophobic narratives that are being very public during these days. And finally, with a global trend of closing civic space, how do you see the opportunities for organizing and mobilizing migrants and refugees in both regions? So I'm going to start with Samar, and then Gabriella, and then Ghida and Ligia. Samar?
I would talk a little bit about the international responsibility. The Global Compact, basically, it's a commitment. It's a global commitment by everyone. And this is the momentum where we are in need for such instruments to build on it and put it into practice and implement it at international level, at national levels. In our countries, unfortunately, as we mentioned, the legal system is not enabling us to utilize these instruments. So maybe we can have a global campaign on how to enforce these commitments at the national level. And we have the voices of refugees and migrants alongside with our efforts in these calls. As Ghida said, we have an issue with access to justice globally for refugees and migrants. Maybe in our part of the world it's more complicated than elsewhere. So we need to start this by what are the legal, let's say, instruments to protect these refugees legally, to enable them to participate, to integrate, and to gain more, let's say, of their rights with a protected sphere. In Jordan, we face an issue of documentation. We face and how to secure these documentation in a lockdown. When we are talking about online court sessions, how refugees they will be represented and will be present when they don't have internet access. Within 2 months, we received 7,000 calls from refugees and migrants only in Jordan. Since the opening of the situation, within 2 weeks, we received 11 cases of gender-based violence to be represented at courts on different levels. So all of these things at a national level, if we fix it, it will enable us to benefit from all the global protection mechanisms that we have. So it has to go side by side, not one in one direction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samar. Gabriella?
Yes, I think I'm going to go with the one with the question of xenophobia. And here I am also going to go back to a point that was raised by Samar. Because I am very concerned about the way many security outfits, many research organizations have started to promote this notion or put out documents and reports on how smuggling and trafficking, or precisely the facilitators of smuggling and trafficking, are likely to become more violent, more sophisticated. I think that's those are some of the terms that are used. Here, I am not suggesting that people are not facing risks or that things are not going to be more difficult for people. But I want us to look at how media, how the state has repeatedly relied on the image of the trafficker and the smuggler, which is very gendered and many times even communicates racist, has all these racist undertones. In the case of Latin America, the Mexican smuggler, el coyote. And in North Africa and the Middle East, the Arab men. And understand that when we focus, when we allow for these images of organized crime, of traffickers and smuggler facilitators to disseminate, they are also communicating messages about the people from those communities. So we are, by and large, also criminalizing in our countries, the countries from the South, because there's no conversation and there's no narrative of what happens when people actually reaches the countries up north. So, or reach countries up north. So I think part of that understanding of how hatred works also implies unpacking the same messages that we as academics and policymakers and practitioners tend to reproduce about crime. I think we have to be more critical of how the ways we talk about race, the ways with which we talk about race and gender, and how it applies to migration.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. Ghida?
Do I have time to make comment about all questions?
You have 2 minutes.
All right. I already mentioned some comments around media and how important it is. And for us at Legal Agenda, we are also a media organization. So we understand how important, just to give you an example, as the leverage that the media coverage, the media coverage was used as a leverage in the negotiations of the garbage workers, as I mentioned earlier. And interestingly, the company did not want to declare what was the result of the negotiation to the media because they were afraid that that would bring more attention and that would be used by other companies as well in terms of how much they've raised wages or not. So I do think this is a very important role as a watchdog and specifically to break that isolation. With regards to community, migrant community mobilization, I've also already discussed this. We definitely do need legal reforms to allow migrant unions to be formed. We've tried in Lebanon with the domestic worker unions, have failed so far. And what is very important here is that the authorities are using the deportation, and as I said, very swift without due process. They're using those deportations as a tool to discipline migrant and community leaders. To go back to the example of the Ramco garbage cleaning company, they initially had requested that their wages were paid in dollars. The first workers who requested that were deported. So the other migrants renounced that claim, compromised on that demand, and switched to just being paid in Lebanese pound, but a higher wage. So deportation is very important, has been used in the past to get rid of community leaders. And until we can actually guarantee rule of law and rights to defense within the whole rights and deportation process for migrants, we will not be able to actually build on better community mobilization. But something to keep an eye on is the increase in the number of binationals, for example, Lebanese, Ethiopian nationals. And I think these are going to be key people in the future in these forms of mobilization. With regards to justice, I also think this is a priority. What we are trying to, one trend in Lebanon is it's very difficult for a migrant, specifically for a domestic worker, to ever see a judge. We're trying. It's very difficult unless they are accused of crimes like theft or anything else. But the whole migration management is done with administrative authorities without coming in, without the justice system or without any judicial oversight being involved, to the extent that we in Lebanon want migration to be criminalized just so that we can have a judge to talk to. Because if we're stuck with the security agency that rules over migration management, we cannot have a reasonable, rational discussion. We cannot talk using legal arguments. We cannot say there are rights. We cannot provide arguments, and we do not get a clear response and a clear answer. We're unable to defend migrants unless they fall under the judicial system. We try to take them into the civil, but very often it's only under the criminal system that we actually manage to defend them. And what we are trying to do, and this is very important because a lot of migrants get deported without being able to claim their rights and claim the rest of their wages and benefits and what they're owed by the employers. And what we are trying to focus on, and that's something for civil society organizations to think of, is cross-country litigation. It's very difficult, but we need to convince the judiciary to initiate those kinds so that all this impunity and lack of accountability for employers can actually be stopped. Because today employers think that if I deport my migrant within 2 days, then they will never come back at me and hold me accountable to everything I've done. And cross-country litigation is key to that accountability. Last comment with regards to the responsibility of the global north, if I still have time. Okay, well, of course, this is something that is very important for us, both at Legal Agenda and the Justicia, that we've been working on. The whole idea that the principle of responsibility sharing is not well implemented, and the Global Compact came to just enumerate some kind of principles without actually putting in place effective mechanisms for that principle to really be to really be effective. We know that 84% of refugees are now in the south, while the north, that has much more access to resources and 2/3 of the world GDP, only has 10% of the world refugee population. And this is clearly exacerbating all the inequalities, leaving the refugees in limbo, and they're being hosted in the most vulnerable communities in the world who are already struggling, and increasing the competition around the limited jobs and resources. This will not be solved unless we have a compulsory and obligatory mechanism of responsibility sharing for the protection of refugees. And maybe we can do a teaser that soon. A video will come out between Legal Agenda and the Justicia around this issue, specifically calling for an efficient implementation of the principle of responsibility sharing.
Thank you, Rita. Ligia, you close. 2 minutes, please. No te escuchamos. Estoy
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to focus on the issue of national human rights institutions and the judiciary. I think that national human rights institutions have been playing a very key role during the last months in the context of the pandemic, trying to set up standards and guidelines for governments on the way they should behave with regard to migrants and refugees in the region. Especially, I remember cases in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil, where the national human rights institutions have been very crucial in this area. There is a former a former ombudsman person in Ecuador that was she was accused of being too close to, or being more concerned about the situation of migrants and refugees and the situation of their own citizens, which is not true, but it shows that they are trying to make a difference. They're trying to play a constructive role. And in the case of the judiciary, also, I think we can say that in the case of the U.S., the judiciary has been the wall against the wall. I mean, they have been able to stop many of the decisions taken by Donald Trump. In the case of Ecuador, for example, in the context of the pandemic, the Constitutional Court took a decision about the standards that the government had to follow in cases of poor people, especially homeless. And that applies, of course, both to local, national people and to refugees and migrants who are homeless in the context of the pandemic. So there are very good examples of good decisions taken by the judiciary and standards set by national human rights institutions.
Thank you, Ligia. And I will add that also here in Colombia, we have very good examples of judges that have defended the right of migrants. Specifically, I remember one case about a person that was deported, and then thanks to a judicial action, we were able to fight for his rights. So thank you, everyone. The discussion we had today shows us that the coronavirus pandemic has made more evident than ever the great inequalities that exist in our societies, where the most vulnerable people, including migrants and refugees, will bear the greatest social costs and are most exposed to the virus. For this reason, it is essential that states promote policies for this population at least two levels. In the short term, they must provide their inclusion in the health response, but guarantee access to shelter, food, medical care, and the immediate release of persons in detention. In the medium term, migration policies should be promoted with a human rights approach, flexible and far-reaching, facilitating regularization process, local inclusion, and ultimately access to rights. Only far-reaching migration policies will reduce the inequality faced by this population. Thank you to everyone who watched this transmission today. Thanks again to our wonderful panelists, Gabriella, Ligia, Ghida, and Samar, for sharing your reflections. We are sure they spark many future discussions. Melissa, would you please show us the graphic you made? This image will be available for download from our social networks shortly. Thank you, Melissa. Melissa? I think she's not available at the moment. So while she's available, just I wanted to say thank. Okay, Melissa is now sharing her screen. So you see now, and you can.
Hello.
Hi, Melissa. You want to say something about your?
Yes, well, as you can see, I was graphic recording of the whole session. And one of the most things that came to my attention was the thing about the inclusion that we have to call for, the cross-country litigation that is a must, and the global justice for all. And how all these pandemic times has reshaped the mobility.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thanks to the Justicia and the Legal Agenda teams for making this possible, especially to our communication team working behind the scenes before and during this session. Finally, I would like to invite you all to our third and last webinar of the series, which will be focused on the closing of civic spaces during COVID-19 and the advocacy and strategic litigation strategies that can be employed to face it. It will be next Thursday, June 11, at the same time as today, 8 a.m. in Colombia and 4 p.m. in Lebanon. Thank you again. Take care and goodbye.